Aye. So welcome to what should have been our first LinkedIn Live with I would agree. I would agree. Unfortunately, LinkedIn seems to have broken. I'm going to take credibility for that. I think it was just the sheer magnetism of having my guest online with us, Simon Norie, who's about to appear in a moment. Thank you everyone for joining us. I wish it could have been live. Hopefully next week's will be a little bit more successful in the technical department, Microsoft, to get on it. Welcome, Simon. Thanks for joining me on our very first AI Would Agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very pleased to be present on the first one, despite LinkedIn's best efforts. But anyway, we are here. So.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully we'll get the audience that would have been watching us live. If you've got any comments, any questions that you would have liked to have asked Simon, feel free to add them on the bottom of the video when you watch this back, and Simon and myself will do our level best to answer you in the plain old comments fashion. But yeah, great to have you on, Simon. And I think something that's been a talking point for us from day one when we first met each other has been how culture can drive or be driven by data. And you've got some fairly unique thoughts in that, and some I'm sure it'll be quite contentious for some people, but that's what we're here for, right? Is what I don't want to do is create a sandbox for people where they just hear their own thoughts all the time. And I personally quite like your vision of how culture can be driven using data, and how the two interact with each other. So I'll kind of I'll hand over, and you can start us away with what your initial thoughts were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and it'd be great. And I am going to deliberately bank stuff a few because, as I say, we haven't got the audience for this one, have we? But I think we've had some good chats about this, so we can use that as a bit of a foil for it. Two things right up front, I think they've always interested me. I mean, I come from a brand-led data background. And when you talk about culture to me, I went on quite a trip about trying to understand how organizations function. And I sort of started to put a lot of human type knowledge into that in terms of the psychological profile of people and the psychological profile of organizations. So culture to me is very much analogous to personality in an organization. And as much as when you look at a culture in an organization and how it can change and morph over time, a lot of the things you can apply to people applies there. So that's one bit of it. So why am I interested in culture? Because I'm interested in trying to make sure that the outcomes an organizations create are good for the people in it and good for the customers. Two things. So I think it should be aligned to the brand of the organization. And I think people quite often talk about culture in isolation. You know, it has a good culture, it has a bad culture. My view is it should have a brand-centric culture, and we can talk a little bit about that. The other one is whether you think you have or you haven't got one, you have. Assume you put more than a couple of people in a room for any length of time, a culture will begin to form. And that culture may be positive and it may be negative. And that's why that personality lens, I think, is quite interesting, because you do and you don't get on with certain types of people. So you will and you won't fit certain types of cultures. And that's one of the core points that leads into measurements and how you can measure culture, is the understanding of it. You know, people do and don't get on with certain types of cultures, just like people do and don't get on with certain types of people. So I'll just pause there, see if there's any reactions, and we can harden up on some of the sort of data and measurement side of it for you as well, if you want. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting because you know, coming from a business where we're a fully remote workforce, and having moved out of that corporate side of things into a more independent workforce, it's seeing that impact that unique individuals can have in the wider team, yeah, and how that can impact on the culture of the team. Like how the, you know, when you remove all those kind of little water cooler discussions, you know, the canteen discussions that people have, and that has to happen in a virtual environment. It's a very different ethos in the business, and I think you can kind of see the culture and the brand of the business a lot easier in that environment, rather than in a big corporate environment where it's all office based. I think that's probably where you've had the most experience, really, isn't it? Like moving between the corporate environments and looking at the strategy from how you get that brand, like what you started off as, what's the essence of a business, and how do you know, like for somebody like me who you know, working further down that line, it sounds quite petrifying, to be honest, like measuring culture. So like what kind of things are we talking about when you talk about measuring culture, Simon?
So I think for me, and I'm a great believer in trying to keep things simple. And as soon as you sort of talk about culture, that's quite a big amorphous thing, isn't it? But then you go, so what does a culture mean? Well, a culture has to have values, beliefs, and behaviours attached to it. And they're a little bit more measurable. So if you can state what forms the culture, so if we want to have an altruistic culture that's very innovative and forward thinking, then we've got to have the values and the behaviours that align to it. And I think where people perhaps stop is either they don't take time to understand what the culture is. So therefore, how can I measure what I don't understand? Or they don't break it down to a level where you can start to make measurements. Interestingly for me, most organisations undertake a level of cultural measurement from dot one, because they'll engage in things like colleague communications or HR surveys or engagement surveys, and they will ask things of people, and they will track things like absenteeism, sickness, churn rate. So we'll look at things, and if you go back to that start point, which is if there is a culture that fits me, and I think you're a great example of this, and some of the posts you put out that are evangelical at times about this sort of discovery of TMAC. When you look at that, that's about fitting a culture. You like the business, you work well for the business, you'll go above and beyond, but this isn't about sort of driving out disproportionate activity, but the culture fits. There's no value conflict, you'll behave, and the behaviours of the company suit you. So therefore, if you were filling in a survey, you'd be ticking a lot of positive boxes for it. And I think that's the first point when people go, how do I measure culture? You've probably got some of the tools sat there already, because you are probably measuring some hard facts, absenteeism, churn rate. I mean, there's a funny one there about percentage of holiday actually taken. Is it a positive sign if they're not taking holidays? But you also get into a lot of surveys these days, can you recommend improvements? Would you recommend us to another employer? And then a big one, which is a big one that sits at the bottom, do you believe we act on the stuff they give you? So there is already a raft of stuff that you could put into this is giving me a good indication of whether I've got a culture that's positive or negative. The bit that's quite often missing is, yeah, but what do I want the culture to be? Sit on top of that. And so therefore, if somebody is disruptive, absent a lot, taking a lot of sickness and complaining about the managers, is that because they've got the problem or the business has got the problem? So the idea of trying to be clear about what your culture is helps you make a decision about whether the issue is with the individual or groups of individuals or with the business. So I'm just going to pause there and get the reaction to it, because I've brought you into that evangelical about the business phrase, but I'll go backwards to sort of go, well, how do I start to layer culture into that? But that comment about people do measure culture currently, whether they think they are or not, is an interesting one for me.
Yeah, I guess there's the whole conversation around, we're very accustomed to the conversation that what gets measured gets improved, right?
Yeah.
But I guess there's also the other conversation that the focus that you put on the metrics that you measure can sometimes encourage the behavior within the team. So if the only thing that you're seen to measure by your team is whether they're present at work or not and whether they're on time or not, that becomes the thing that they think you're focusing on.
Yeah.
And it is the thing that you're focusing on. But then it becomes a conversation around, well, actually, I don't really feel valued by the business because the only thing they really care about is whether I'm here or not.
Yeah.
They don't care about my wellness or how I feel about the business. So therefore, actually, by measuring those things, which are that business should be measuring those things, but it's about, I think, a little bit about how you present that to the team and whether you show them what other things that you're measuring that are for their benefit and how you measure those things. There's other things out there that you can look at within the business that that are quite clearly for their welfare and their well-being, but actually you don't put as much pressure on those things to be measured correctly because they're not as directly responsible for bottom line savings for the business, for example.
Absolutely.
So if it doesn't drive pounds, then the business is less precious about measuring them. But actually, it does drive pounds, like not directly, which is the hard thing to prove. These sorts of things is like it's almost, you talk about customer experience. Customer experience can be quite hard to measure, but ultimately we know for a fact that it drives your return on investment and your customer lifetime value, and therefore your revenue and your pounds. But why do we not tend to treat employee experience in that same way on a large scale?
Yeah, and that's don't get me segued off around people versus customer experience. But again, it comes back to that same phrase for me around using data to drive culture. You go, look, so if my culture should be defined, and I think this is why a lot of single operators or dominant character businesses work quite well, because the bit I'm advocating is culture is very much a emotional thing, analogous to personality. And if you've got a strong personality, then people will automatically conform or not conform to that personality. But if you ratchet up to some of those things there, so my example of within HR, you're probably measuring things that give you an indication as to whether you have or you haven't got a coherent culture. The question is it the right culture? So to be slightly controversial for a minute, I could decide that I want a culture that's very aggressive and domineering in terms of what it does and takes no prisoners. And I could right, I'm going to create a culture that does that. And it will be about the level of management we've got, about the level of deals that we conquest. It will be about what other people perceive as in the marketplace. It will look at our level of agreeableness, our level of aggression. And you'll create a set of measures that look for all of those traits. And you will reward those traits, and you will punish or disencourage, should we say, the traits that don't fit. Now, that's an example. And there is a thing where you come through and go, we've got this thing that culture has to always be nice. I'm not saying it shouldn't be nice, by the way. But what culture is, it's a set of rules and behaviours that people do or don't conform to, that you decide does or doesn't create success. So it confers a benefit. There's loads of stuff that's been done around what culture's trying to do. So in that, if we turn it into the more positive one, which people probably, because there's a lot of purpose that's coming in organisations, and I suspect that's because we're now getting to the point within business where we go, look, I want to work for things that make me feel better, for Christ's sake. I'll leave the aggressive bit over there. They can all go and do that. Can all go and do used car sales or whatever it is that you used to do. But if there's a bit about, say you've got a value that talks about integrity. So integrity would always be about doing the right thing. And it would always be about making sure you do right by people. Well, if you decide integrity is a part of your culture, and that's a value you have, and therefore you've got a belief system, behaviours that you need to do, then you can look at that and start to create measures. And again, people go, well, that's quite complicated. Well, you go, if I can explain that in a level that the people at a colleague level understand, you can say to them, do you think we always deal with our customers at the end of the day? Yes or no, or scale as 1 to 5. You've started to put a measurement system in that is something that you can track. You could do a little pulse survey out on that. We live in an app-enabled world now. You could just send that out into business and see. If you wanted it to be about that caring side, most people run internal comms programs. So what you can start to do is go, are we signposting the caring things that the business has done and that the colleagues have done in this business for the customers and for each other? On that survey to ensure that the caring message is being got across, that it's coming across, that that's what people are taking out of it. So the thing to me about can we use data to drive culture, it doesn't need to be this massive sort of almost psychology type level. I'm going to have to look at the personality of an organization, but it starts with, can you clearly state what you want your culture to be? Can you get that into things that can be measured, which are usually behaviors? I've got values, I've got beliefs, and I've got behaviors. The behaviors you can usually measure, right? And that would be, do people demonstrate a real keenness to recommend our business to other people? Do people say they value the contribution of the colleagues, mate? I'm going down that integrity in a nice place to work. So these are measures you can make. And that's, to me, the cornerstone of how you start to drive data to measure culture. And it goes back to one of the founding concepts I got out of data marketing, which is recency, frequency, and value. Do you ask people recently enough, frequently enough, place enough value and emphasis on what they tell you about whether you're delivering the behaviours that support the culture you're trying to do? And usually the disjoints come is when it's quite evident that you don't do that. And usually the biggest party that's guilty of that is directors and senior leaders who say one thing and do another, or collect survey information and do nothing about it. So that to me is the cornerstone of data to drive culture. You have to define it, get it to a level of behaviours that can be measured, then you have to go and ask and engage with the audience for it. And at its simplest level, that to me is the start point for doing this type of thing. So I don't know if that triggers any other.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think it's almost those sorts of conversations that I had at a senior level in a boardroom somewhere. Somebody has a great idea, like, you know, we've refreshed our brand strategy. We understand where our mission statement is. All those guys and ladies in that room kind of understand that intrinsically. They spent hours talking about it. But what they forget to pass on is that message to the teams that they want to gain the insight from. You know, it becomes oh, well, here's your yearly survey where we're going to ask you a pile of questions, and you can answer them and be as open and honest as you want, and we'll act on that feedback. And even if they do act on that feedback, the frustrating thing for the employees can often be that they don't understand the importance of the questions that they're being asked in the first place. So therefore, they don't give the consideration to the answers that they probably need to give, because, to your point, they haven't simplified it enough for them to get it. What is it that I'm actually being asked here? And what impact is my answer likely to have on the business? And if the answer is, you know, predominantly previously, we've taken these surveys, we've done them, and we've actually done very little with them, the answer is that your survey results that you're going to get from your team are going to be misconstrued and irrelevant, really, because people won't put that effort in. What you're going to need to do then, once you're at that point, is really you need to re-engage on a large scale your entire workforce and set the tone for, this is going to be something completely different to what we've done before. Here's our brand statement. Here's our culture. Here's where we want to be. You know, and to a certain extent, kind of going back on that culture thing, is it's almost the same as when you're trying to sell product, right? Is you don't want to boil the ocean. There's no point trying to sell what you've got to everyone. You've got an individual client profile that you want to match it up to. There's specific use cases for whatever you do. And you can feel when that's not going right, when you're working with the wrong people, and it's just like you grate off each other rather than working in sharing your energy and going in the right direction. And I think it's much the same with the employees. You know, we're in this weird position in the UK right now where it's an employees market, right? So the employers have to do everything they can to attract anyone who will work for them. My concern at the moment is that actually a lot of these businesses are now probably attracting the wrong sort of people, because they're attracting people for the wrong reasons. Like, I'm paying an extra bonus fee to come on board with my business, but actually 6 months down the line, that person's going to be completely disengaged because they haven't joined the business because of the culture or the brand.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's a really important point. And there's two bits in there. So the first bit is your success at delivering your culture starts at recruitment. That's where it starts to. And then it probably ends with saying less and doing more. And we've got a sort of volume related thing that relates to a lot of stuff. We'll push all these initiatives out. People don't deal with lots of things. But if it was, look, we're going to be innovative. That's one of the core things we decided to do. So we're going to create an innovation culture, which means that we need each team to come up with 5 new ideas a week. Let's measure whether you come up with 5 new ideas a week, and then we'll act on one of them and we'll put it back to a vote. You can create quite simple pyramids of things that actually focus on the culture and reward it. But at some point, what you tend to see is people keep that at too clever a level. We're going to be known as the innovative think tank of Europe on. And well, yeah, that's brilliant, but I'm not really sure what that means to me. If you boil it down to, it just means as your team had 3 new ideas or improved 3 processes this week or not, then you can do something with it. Or they just come out with loads of stuff, and then people are overfaced with it, don't know what to do. There's BAU that's going on as well. So I think, to me, there's the start at recruitment, and that means have a profile of the people who will work with your culture. Because you talked about sales process where it grates. That, from a cultural point, that's a values conflict. So if I was doing that as a person, I'd go, well, the values don't match there. So don't put somebody with high integrity in I'll sell them anything as long as they get me sale type environment. They're just going to be stressed to death straight away. So what you've got to look for is, have I got somebody who's got a values match to the culture that we are trying to maintain, who brings different skills and capabilities? You're not trying to make clones here, but it starts at recruitment. And as you say, it'll be interesting to see how many people end up going. We'll just take whatever we can. And what you might see as that comes into the business is increasing churn, challenge against the ways in which things are done, dissatisfaction with what's being done, you know, causing problems within teams and all. And I don't mean, oh, it's always good to have a naysayer. You know, they're really trying to dismantle the culture, and they can be quite damaging things that take organisations a long time to recover from. But equally, what some people do think it is very complicated. Boiling it down to how do I take that belief into that behaviour so I can measure it? That, you know, that should be relatively simple, should be. But it is something that a lot of people don't do. They stop, as you say, at that board level, the door opens, as we call the mugs and t-shirts launch comes out, and everybody goes, brilliant, I'm not actually sure what I meant to do with that. So I'll carry on with what I've been doing for the last 2 years. And I'm sure somebody will come and tell me if I'm getting it right or it's wrong. So
yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you can, you know, like I said at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, and everybody's sick of talking about COVID. So sorry, everybody who's watching this, I'm going to bring it up again. I said this at the beginning of the pandemic, right? There were businesses that they went over and above regulations. They didn't wait for the government to stipulate what needed to be done. They went out, they knew what was coming, they did it themselves, and they probably went one step further than the regulations asked them to do. They made their customers feel safe. They made their customers feel welcomed and like they could go into the shops when they were open. And when they weren't open, they did things that engaged their customers and were true to their brand and their culture and their identity. So if you look at brands like Dr. Martens and VF Corp as an example, like they did tremendously well throughout lockdown, even though their main business traditionally was always retail. It's a very physical environment, lots of shoes, those sorts of things are all sort of very physical in their sales process. And actually, what happened as a result is like those guys haven't really struggled with their employment, they haven't really struggled with retaining their staff, they haven't really struggled to get new members of staff on board because they've stayed true to their brand and their culture, and actually they've had a really good time of things, both financially and in terms of their employment. And I think that's a lesson to take forward for everyone. It's like we can do that with customers because those brands were true to what they set out to do. They've always had a very deep affinity with that. And I think it would be good to see, you know, a lot of businesses continue to do that now that we're I struggle to say coming out the other side of it, but now that we're a lot more open in terms of what we can do, it's kind of starting to show for a lot of those businesses that didn't, because they've had that spike where the lockdown came in, their business struggled because they weren't doing the right things. Then they come out the other side of it, started to do the right things, but it was too late. The public acknowledged that and voted with their feet. Now a lot of these businesses are trying to attract the right staff through whatever measures necessary. And then kind of the knock-on impact of that, I reckon, in 6 months' time is their customer experience is going to be rock bottom because of all these people who've come on board and don't agree with the brand. So it's amazing to think of the huge context in terms of where that brand and culture can actually impact on the business. And you're right, like if you can manage to drill down to the data points individually that matter to that brand strategy and that culture that you want to have within the business, it really does have a measurable impact on the other side of things. But it's kind of hard to, I guess, until you make that conscious decision to drill down and make it simple, then it's easy to procrastinate with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people underestimate how simple humans are. There's that sort of Pavlov dog response to it. And we are a little bit like that. We just need a little jink every so often. And I think because people don't go, how do, you know, brand something I externalize, I don't internalize. Well, you should internalize it because it defines the culture and the personality. If the culture and the personality are aligned to the brand, and what a brand does and having an aligned culture does is it creates consistency. It stops things being disruptive or disjointed when people engage with it. And what it does is it does that almost automatically. So intuitively, people will do more of the right things that are on brand, that are supported by colleagues around them because they seem to be culturally aligned. And then what you don't need to do is have a presenteeism management style that task manages people layered onto it to keep it all in order. So when people say, oh, I've managed to work remotely really well, yeah, well, A, you'll have a role that probably enables you to do, probably, that could be, but equally, you'll probably have a culture that supports it. It's not against the culture of the organization to work remotely. And I think that's a big thing. So when people go, why is it worth doing it? it's really worth topping and tailing. You've got some measurement of what your existing culture is doing it now, but what you want to do is go, all right, well, what culture should I have? How do I start to do that, and how do I drill it down? And you're looking for behaviors that you can get feedback on that are informed by these would or wouldn't be appropriate to the culture, which does or doesn't fit the brand. And the more you can get that working seamlessly, the better it's going to be for you to take advantage of distributed talent, different ways of working, and you're going to get and retain that talent better, and you're going to deliver a better service to your customers ultimately.
Fantastic. It feels like we've fixed the world there, Simon. Always a pleasure to chat with you, Simon, and get your thoughts on things. And hopefully there's some really actionable sort of value that people can get from that and take away to their own business, and start trying to think about how they're doing things. How, you know, it's coming up to that time of year where potentially we're looking at how we can do things differently next year already. Hopefully there's some businesses out there now that can kind of listen to this and take something away from that, and make a change to their own implementations and systems. But look, obviously this was supposed to be a LinkedIn live. Unfortunately, we've had to record it. I'll pop the video up as soon as we're done. Everybody who's watched it, thank you very much for coming along. Hopefully next week's will actually be live if LinkedIn doesn't break again. I'm still taking credit for it.
Absolutely.
If you want to drop any questions, please feel free to reach out and connect with Simon and myself. We're obviously both linked on the event and the broadcast. Ask some questions in the comments, and Simon and myself will get back over the next couple of days and hopefully give you some answers to anything that